Okay. All right. After 9 years in office, today's announcement by Daniel Andrews on housing is possibly his most shameless con on aspirational Victorians. And I refer in particular to young Victorians and migrants who have come to this state for the opportunities our state offers. And today they've been offered nothing. What we've seen today, we've heard all before. Daniel Andrews simply can't be believed when it comes to home ownership and housing affordability. We know that last year he openly said that he thought people weren't interested in home ownership. They were happy to rent. And today he expects Victorians to believe him when he says that he's committed to this announcement that he's made today. Frankly, Daniel Andrews could have promised 8 million homes in the next 10 years, because in a year's time he will not have built 80,000 homes, let alone the 800,000 homes over 10 years that he's promised today. We've heard all of these promises before. Remember, back in 2017, Daniel Andrews promised a 15-year pipeline of new homes to address the home ownership and housing crisis that's been gripping our state now for many years. And yet today, he comes out with an announcement and expects all of us to believe that all of a sudden he can address a problem, a crisis that's been occurring under his watch over his 9 years in office. All of this sounds just like the Commonwealth Games all over again. Big promises with no track record and no real detail on how he proposes to actually achieve the goals he's set out today. There's no way he will achieve the goals he's set out today for Victorians. Remember, he's the architect of the housing crisis that we see in Victoria. And he doesn't understand that his government is the single biggest contributor to the costs of construction in this state, which has put home ownership outside the reach of so many aspirational Victorians. Higher payroll taxes, higher work cover taxes, higher land taxes, and now today the 50th new tax to affect Victorians, particularly holiday makers. And this new tax that Daniel Andrews has announced today is only being levied to fill budget holes created by Homes Victoria, the entity that Daniel Andrews set up in 2020 to deal with social and affordable housing in our state. He's admitted today that the only reason he's imposing this tax is to fill the budget black hole and the incompetence that his government has engaged in with respect to Homes Victoria. Victorians shouldn't be punished in this way. They're doing it hard enough at the moment. And what Daniel Andrews is going to do is make it even more expensive for people to take holidays, to go with their family and friends, to visit Victoria. It's great tourism destinations. Daniel Andrews just made much more expensive. No one can believe Daniel Andrews when he says that he's going to fix the housing crisis in this state. He's on record saying that he doesn't believe in home ownership. He thinks everybody is happy to rent. And I want to speak directly today to Victoria's young people in particular and our migrant communities who have come here with such burning aspiration to own their own home. My message to all of you is don't lose hope. Myself and my colleagues believe strongly in home ownership as a genuine goal. We genuinely believe it. That's why I have it as a specific shadow portfolio in my shadow cabinet. It's why I want to make sure through our tax discussion paper, which looks at cost of living and how to reduce the cost burdens on Victorian households and Victorian businesses, also people can have their shot at owning their own home in Victoria. I believe in it. I want to support young people and aspirational Victorians in particular who want to own their own home. Daniel Andrews doesn't believe in it. He never has. And in 9 years of office, he has nothing to show for housing and addressing the crisis that his government has done so much to create. I'll hand over to Jess now.
Thanks very much, John. And today we have not seen the government announce anything that's going to make it easier for young Victorians in particular to own their own home. In the documents that the government has released today, there is only one reference to home ownership, one reference to being able to buy your own home, and that's through a program where the government co-owns your home. We want to see more Victorians being able to buy their own home, to have the financial security that home ownership brings, and today's plan does nothing to actually address that issue. The other issue here is we put out a set of guiding principles that are purely focused on actually increasing the supply of homes in Victoria. The affordability crisis in Victoria is being driven by a lack of homes, a lack of places for people to call home. The plan today does not address this issue. We've seen another tax put in place following a land tax increase in the budget this year, making it a place where people don't want to invest in property anymore. And investing in property is critical to our rental market. It's fueling our rental crisis, and today, another tax that makes that harder. We've also seen from the government the fact that they are going to silence the voices of locals when it comes to planning decisions. Planning decisions that impact local suburbs, local neighbourhoods, and locals will no longer have a voice in many of those decisions. We said that we wanted to see government work with local councils to allow for local residents to have a say in appropriate development. Today, that voice has been removed and has been silenced by this government. Finally, we've seen a large target put forward by the government. Not a target that works with local councils, that looks at how that's going to be put across inner Melbourne, outer Melbourne, the growth suburbs or regional Victoria, but just a target right across the state. No targets when it comes to local councils. But the question is, how are those additional homes going to be built? A house will not build itself. And we've seen over the past few months a crisis in the residential construction sector. We've seen major home builders, volume builders like Porter Davis collapse, with Victorians being left stranded with half-built homes and being left without their deposit. Today, the real question is, if we're going to increase the supply of housing, why is Daniel Andrews not addressing the crisis when it comes to the residential construction sector? Why are we not looking at the impacts on labour, on supplies when it comes to the government's big build, drawing many of those critical supplies and labour into those major projects and pushing up costs? These are the issues we really need to look at if we're actually going to increase the supply of homes in Victoria. I'll hand over to Sam.
Sam.
Thank you. Well, confirmation today of a 50th new or increased tax under the Andrews Labor government since 2014. This time a 7.5% tax, a holiday and tourism tax, the highest of its kind in the world and the only one of its kind in this country. The latest Tourism Research Australia data shows that this comes at possibly the worst time for regional tourism. Their data shows that 2023, the month of May and the month of June, tourism spend is down on 2022, 21% and 16% in those months respectively. This tax is only going to affect those hard-working Victorians who have saved up money to be able to take a week away, a weekend away, a trip with their family out into our regions. The people that go to regional Victoria are Victorians. It is now going to be hard-working Victorians who are paying an extra 7.5% to fill the burden and to cover the debt and to manage the housing crisis that Daniel Andrews has created. It is hard-working Victorians who are going to be paying that bill. Instead of spending that money in our cafes, our restaurants, our pubs, they're going to be directly paying it to Homes Victoria to fund housing that the Andrews Labor government hasn't built up until this point.
Thanks, well done, Sam. Any questions?
Is there any aspect of the housing statement that you do agree with, that you do welcome?
Yeah, look, we obviously welcome reductions in red tape and unnecessary bureaucratic processes. Anything that can reasonably expedite planning approvals, we obviously support that. And the government has finally come to the party after months of us raising the issue that we need more supply. We'll need to know where and how the government proposes to make that supply release publicly known, but we certainly support that. Our main concerns, though, that we've been speaking about in the last few moments, in particular surround the tax impost. So we know that the holiday tax will cost Victorians. All of those costs will be passed on to Victorian holiday makers. They won't be borne by the homeowners and the investors who own those properties. And as Daniel Andrews admits in his comments today, it will do nothing to actually increase supply. It's just a fairly rank revenue measure to fill the budget black hole around the incompetently managed Homes Vic. We also are keen to see the details around the requirements if developers want the expedited process in terms of providing social and affordable housing as components of their projects, and how those costs will be passed on to other home buyers. So we're particularly concerned to investigate, given the Premier's fairly broad comments today, what impacts that particular requirement will have on other home buyers, because we anticipate that if developers have to accommodate a 10% or a 15% requirement in order to secure the Daniel Andrews approval for projects, we are concerned that the costs of doing that will be passed on in the form of higher prices across the board, perhaps not limited to the projects concerned, but expanded right across the construction sector, so that home buyers who are already struggling to afford their own home will actually have to pay more in order for that to happen. And I guess the implication of that is that we're concerned to see whether Daniel Andrews is actually cost shifting. So actually shifting the costs of his own responsibility to provide those Victorians in need with access to social and affordable housing, and passing that on ultimately to Victorian home buyers. So we'll be keen to look at that. But there are some aspects where we're obviously supportive of, but there's a lot in there that we're concerned about, and we're concerned for Victorians who will face higher prices when they go to buy their own home.
What about underquoting? Maybe this is something, Jess, you want to add to too. What do you make of the government's efforts to introduce legislation to punish agents that underquote ultimately?
Well, obviously, we'll look at the detail, and underquoting has been a problem. The government didn't have any detail on that today, so again, we'll await, along with everybody else, the details of that proposal. Jess, I'm not sure if you had anything on that as well.
No, I think that's right, John. So we'll look at the detail of that. And as John said, it has been a problem in the industry. And as someone who has spent time going to auction after auction, inspection after inspection, and to be let down when you get there and you're waiting for the reserve price to come out and you see that it's much higher than what have been listed, I think this is an area there could be reform, and particularly for younger Victorians, it can be very frustrating. So this is certainly an area we'll look at, but we'll wait for further detail.
Is this something, sorry Jess, before you go, is this something that you've looked at from a policy point of view before, in terms of maybe legislation to prevent agents from doing it, or is this an idea from the government that you may be willing to support?
Well, this has been a widespread issue for some time. This has been something that the industry has been speaking about, that I think policymakers have been very aware of. There's been attempts in the past to address these issues, but we'll look at whatever the legislation is that the government puts forward in detail and come to a position on that in the near future.
Where do you stand on the rental reform? So the 90-day eviction notice, no rent rises for new tenants, portable rental bonds, that sort of thing.
Yeah, obviously we support fairness. There has to be fairness, and that's always a balance between the rights of those who need access to housing and have a roof over their head. But we also need to make sure that nothing drives landlords out of the sector. We need people to be investing. We want more people to put their properties on the long-term rental market. That's ultimately what we want to encourage. So it's about a balance. It's about how we can make sure that tenants have security that they need at prices they can afford, but also landlords are willing to come forward and say, yeah, that's a system we can operate in, and we want to put our properties on the market so we can give more Victorians a roof over their head.
I might just add to that.
Yeah, sure.
I think we do share concerns here that there is a rental cap or a rental control being put in place, looking at how rental increases are not permitted under the ability to end a lease and then put that rental amount up over the course of the next lease. We'll look at that in a lot of detail. We certainly don't want to see any form of rental cap or rental freeze or rent control put in place, because we simply are seeing investors leave the market. We've seen over the last 12 months, about 25% of Victorians who own rental properties actually put those properties on the market and take them out of the rental market. And that's only fueling our rental crisis. Now, the Premier himself has acknowledged that rental caps are not the answer, that they actually work in the opposite direction of increasing supply. So we certainly wouldn't want to see that coming in place through these reforms today.
Any other questions?
Sam, do you think it was mooted that the Airbnb tax before today would raise more money on the peninsula than in the city? Now that the details are out, is that the case?
Well, look, $70 million Daniel Andrews came out today and says that this new Airbnb, this holiday and tourism tax, is going to raise. I mean, let's be very clear, that is purely a cash grab. I mean, it, by the Premier's own admission, is going to drive no properties back to the long-term rental market. It is purely going to be filling the big black hole of debt that the Andrews Labor government has created itself. That is all it is doing. It is a 7.5% holiday and tourism tax. That is it. No benefit for the long-term market, all just going back into filling the $226 billion that he has created himself.
What effect will this have on the community that you represent?
Well, look, it's also going to come down, and we'll have to look at how the Shires handle this as well, I think. I mean, obviously, the Mornington Peninsula has a probably disproportionately high number of Airbnbs, and we need to look at a real housing solution for the Mornington Peninsula. We want to see actually something being done. We have homelessness, we have a tourism sector and a hospitality sector that does need accommodation for its workers, and we heard the Premier say that today, but nothing in this strategy actually does anything to benefit that industry whatsoever. We need to look at solutions that are actually going to increase supply. But what we also need to do is make sure that, we need accommodation for workers, but we also need to look after those holidaymakers and the businesses coming down there. If people are spending more on a tax and less in the business, does the business also survive? And do people then need somewhere to stay to work in that business? I think you've got to look at it as a whole holistic approach, not just let's make a quick 7.5% grab on those people who've worked hard for their money to cover up our big problem.
Yeah, well said. Any other questions?
First of all, about planning reforms.
Yep.
Giving the state more power a good move, do you think? Or is that something that you would embrace?
We're very concerned about the power grab that is obvious in Daniel Andrews' announcement today. Daniel Andrews, like governments before him, have always had the power to intervene when projects of importance need to be expedited. But we're very concerned that Daniel Andrews is really saying in this announcement today that he's going to strip from local communities their democratic voice. That's not fair and it's not right. So we will be very concerned, and we reserve our position on that, and we'll be fighting against any attempts to rob local communities of their voice when it's not fair to do so. Obviously, we support planning reforms that can expedite projects where there's obvious benefits. Sure, red tape reduction is something that we've been calling for ourselves for a long time. But as for stripping local communities of their democratic voices, we don't support that.
And is there a perverse incentive in the sense that they introduced a windfall gains tax, and 2 years later they're talking about some pretty large-scale rezoning that could see some of that money come back into their coffers?
The windfall gains tax was always a revenue grab by the Andrews government to shift equity from local council balance sheets to the state's balance sheet. It was simply helping the Andrews government deal with its financial troubles. So yes, the Andrews government will benefit from its own changes at the expense of local councils, which obviously have to do their bit in planning reform. But everything about today's announcement suggests that one way or another, Victorians will be paying more. They'll be paying more either in the form of higher taxes, or they'll be paying more because the reforms Daniel Andrews has announced today are certain to increase house prices across the board. So one way or another, Daniel Andrews' big housing statement will be big extra costs on Victorian households. Thank you very much. Cheers.